Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Story 1. Brian Schaefer was born on February 25, 1979, in Pickerington, Ohio. A bright and ambitious young man with a warm smile and charismatic personality. By 2006, he was 27 years old and in his second year at Ohio State University's medical school, working toward becoming a doctor. Those who knew Brian described him as friendly, outgoing, and passionate about both his studies and his love for music. Brian stood about 6 feet 2 inches tall with brown hair and hazel eyes. He had a distinctive appearance with a lean build and often wore a characteristic smile that friends said could light up a room. He came from a close-knit family and maintained strong relationships with his father, Randy Schaefer, and his brother, Derek. Tragically, Brian's mother, Renee Schaefer, had passed away from cancer in 2006, just weeks before Brian would disappear, adding a layer of grief to his life during this period. Columbus, Ohio, early spring 2006. The Ohio State University campus was bustling with activity as students prepared for upcoming exams and looked forward to spring break. The Ugly Tuna Saloon, a popular bar located in the South Campus Gateway complex, was a frequent gathering spot for students and locals alike. On the evening of Friday, March 31, 2006, Brian had plans to celebrate the beginning of spring break. Earlier that day, Brian had spoken with his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, who was leaving for a spring break trip to Miami. They had discussed their own upcoming vacation to Miami planned for later that summer. According to those who interacted with him that day, Brian seemed to be in good spirits despite the recent loss of his mother. The South Campus Gateway area where the Ugly Tuna was located had opened fairly recently, bringing new life to the High Street corridor near campus. The multi-level complex housed various restaurants, bars, and shops. The Ugly Tuna Saloon itself was located on the second floor, accessible via escalators and elevators from the street level. That night, temperatures in Columbus hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A light rain fell intermittently throughout the evening, creating a misty atmosphere as groups of students moved between venues along High Street. The sidewalks glistened under street lamps, reflecting the neon signs of bars and restaurants that lined the busy thoroughfare. The timeline of Brian's last known whereabouts begins at around 9 p.m. on March 31, 2006. Brian and his friend William Clint Florence met for drinks at the Ugly Tuna Saloon to celebrate the start of spring break. According to witnesses, the two spent some time there before deciding to visit other bars in the area. Around 10:30 p.m., Brian and Clint moved to nearby establishments, including Larry's, a bar also located in the campus area. They were joined by Clint's friend, Meredith Reed, who would later drive both men back to the Ugly Tuna Saloon. Security footage from that night showed Brian, Clint, and Meredith returning to the Ugly Tuna at approximately 1:15 a.m., now April 1. The camera captured Brian at the top of an escalator, talking briefly with two young women before moving back toward the bar entrance. Clint and Meredith would later report that they lost track of Brian inside the crowded establishment as closing time approached. At 2 a.m., as the bar prepared to close, Clint and Meredith tried to locate Brian. Unable to find him, they assumed he had left without telling them and decided to leave themselves. What makes this case particularly perplexing is that security cameras positioned at the only public exit never recorded Brian leaving the Ugly Tuna Saloon. When Brian failed to return home that night, there was initially little concern. It wasn't unusual for a college student to stay out late or crash at a friend's place. However, when Brian missed a scheduled flight to Miami with his girlfriend on Monday, April 3, alarm bells began to ring. Alexis Wagoner, Brian's girlfriend of about 3 years, had been trying to reach him throughout the weekend without success. After learning he had missed their flight, she contacted Brian's father, Randy Schaefer, who promptly reported his son missing to the Columbus Police Department. The investigation began immediately, with Detective John Hurst taking the lead. Police reviewed the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon and surrounding businesses. The footage clearly showed Brian entering the bar but never leaving through any of the monitored exits. This puzzling detail would become the central mystery of the case. In the days that followed, authorities conducted extensive searches of the area. They interviewed staff and patrons who had been at the Ugly Tuna that night. Brian's cell phone, which had last pinged near the bar, had not been used since approximately 2 a.m. on April 1. His credit cards showed no activity after that night. His car remained parked at his apartment. Investigators considered multiple scenarios. Could Brian have left through an emergency exit not covered by cameras? Had he somehow managed to leave the following morning when the cameras weren't operating? Or had something more sinister occurred inside the establishment? As days turned into weeks, the search for Brian intensified. Columbus police brought in cadaver dogs to search the construction areas around the South Campus Gateway complex. They analyzed blueprints of the building housing the Ugly Tuna, looking for any possible exit route or hiding place that might have been overlooked. Brian's family and friends organized search parties, distributing flyers throughout Columbus and the surrounding areas. Randy Schaefer, still grieving the recent loss of his wife, devoted himself entirely to finding his son. The case began to attract media attention, with local news outlets covering the mysterious disappearance. Detective Hurst and his team pursued several leads. They investigated whether Brian might have been despondent over his mother's recent passing. However, those closest to Brian insisted that while he was grieving, he showed no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. In fact, he had been making future plans, including the upcoming Miami trip with Alexis and continuing his medical education. Investigators also looked into Brian's background for any potential enemies or conflicts. By all accounts, Brian was well-liked and had no known serious disputes with anyone. His bank accounts showed healthy balances, and there were no signs of financial troubles or involvement with drugs or other illicit activities. One theory that emerged involved the possibility of Brian falling victim to the smiley face killer, a controversial theory suggesting a group or individual responsible for the drowning deaths of college-aged men across the Midwest. However, there was no evidence directly linking Brian's disappearance to these cases, and many law enforcement officials remained skeptical of the theory itself. Clint Florence, Brian's friend who had spent most of the evening with him, provided investigators with his account of the night. According to Clint, he had last seen Brian inside the Ugly Tuna shortly before closing time. When interviewed by police, Clint eventually retained a lawyer and declined to take a polygraph test, which some found suspicious. However, there has never been any evidence connecting him to Brian's disappearance. Meredith Reed, who had joined Brian and Clint later in the evening, cooperated fully with the investigation. She took a polygraph test and passed. According to her statement, she had also lost track of Brian in the crowded bar and assumed he had either left already or was planning to stay later. The two young women seen talking with Brian on the security footage were identified and interviewed. They reported a brief, friendly conversation with him but provided no information that would explain his subsequent disappearance. Bar staff from the Ugly Tuna were also interviewed. Some remembered seeing Brian that night, but none recalled seeing him leave or noticed anything unusual about his behavior. A manager confirmed that the bar was thoroughly checked before closing, including restrooms and storage areas, with no sign of Brian. Perhaps most puzzling was the testimony of Alexis Wagoner, Brian's girlfriend. She reported receiving a call from Brian around midnight, during which he told her he was on his way back to the Ugly Tuna, and that he loved her. This timing suggests Brian was still out with Clint between bar visits, shortly before the security footage captured him returning to the Ugly Tuna. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain Brian's disappearance. The first possibility is that Brian somehow left the Ugly Tuna without being captured on camera. The bar had multiple exits, including a service door that led to a construction area. If Brian had used this exit, he might have left without being recorded. However, police considered this unlikely, as the area was dangerous and not easily navigable, especially for someone who had been drinking. Another theory suggests Brian never left the bar that night and met with foul play inside the establishment or in an area not covered by cameras. Investigators conducted thorough searches of the building, including crawl spaces and mechanical areas, but found no evidence to support this theory. Some have speculated that Brian chose to disappear voluntarily. He had recently lost his mother to cancer and might have been dealing with grief in ways not apparent to others. However, those who knew him insisted he was coping well and looking forward to the future. He had no history of disappearing, had left all his possessions behind, and had plans he seemed excited about. A fourth theory involves the possibility that Brian left the bar the following morning when the security cameras weren't operational. After closing, the bar would have been cleaned, and perhaps Brian had fallen asleep somewhere inside or had been allowed to stay by someone with access. This would explain why he wasn't captured leaving on camera, but it doesn't explain why he never contacted anyone afterward. Some internet sleuths have suggested more elaborate scenarios, including the possibility that Brian assumed a new identity or was enrolled in a witness protection program. However, there is no credible evidence supporting these more speculative theories. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer had a profound impact on his family and the Columbus community. His father, Randy Shaffer, never gave up the search for his son. Tragically, Randy passed away in September 2008 after a tree fell on him during a storm, never knowing what happened to Brian. Brian's brother, Derek, continues to seek answers. In media interviews over the years, Derek has expressed his determination to discover the truth about his brother's fate, though he has acknowledged the possibility that the family may never know exactly what happened that night. The Columbus Police Department has kept the case open, periodically reviewing evidence and following up on new leads. Detective Hurst, who led the initial investigation, has stated that the case remains one of the most perplexing of his career. The lack of any confirmed sighting of Brian after he entered the Ugly Tuna continues to baffle investigators. In the years since Brian's disappearance, there have been occasional reported sightings, none of which have been confirmed. In 2020, renewed interest in the case emerged when a Facebook account bearing Brian's name and photo briefly appeared online with a single post stating, "I'm here." However, this was quickly determined to be a cruel hoax. America's Most Wanted featured Brian's case twice, generating numerous tips but no definitive answers. Various podcasts and true crime shows have also covered the disappearance, helping to keep public awareness alive but not yielding any significant breakthroughs. The Ugly Tuna Saloon itself closed in 2018, though it later reopened under new management as the Tuna. The building's original configuration, which might have held clues to Brian's disappearance, has been altered over the years. Today, more than 18 years after that April morning, Brian Shaffer's disappearance remains unsolved. His case has become one of the most discussed mysteries in true crime communities, particularly because of the puzzling circumstances. A man walks into a bar on camera but is never seen leaving. The case has heightened awareness about missing persons investigations, particularly the challenges posed by urban environments with complex building structures and limited surveillance coverage. It has also highlighted how quickly someone can vanish, even in a crowded public place surrounded by friends. For the Ohio State University community, Brian's disappearance serves as a somber reminder of the unpredictability of life. The medical school where he studied established a scholarship in his name, ensuring that his aspiration to help others lives on through future physicians. Online communities dedicated to solving cold cases continue to discuss theories and analyze available evidence. The case is frequently cited in discussions about the limitations of surveillance technology and the importance of comprehensive missing persons protocols. Brian's story also underscores the enduring pain experienced by families of missing persons who live in a state of ambiguous loss, without closure or certainty. For Derek Schaefer and others who cared about Brian, the years have brought neither answers nor resolution. In Columbus, Brian's case has not been forgotten. Periodic media coverage, particularly around anniversaries of his disappearance, helps maintain public awareness. Local authorities continue to welcome any information that might solve this enduring mystery. As we reflect on the disappearance of Brian Schaefer, we're reminded of how fragile and precious our connections are. In a moment, someone's entire future, their dreams, relationships, and potential, can vanish without explanation, leaving behind questions that may never be answered. Brian was just 27 years old when he disappeared, studying to become a doctor, a path that would have allowed him to help countless others throughout a long career. He had recently endured the loss of his mother but was looking forward to traveling with his girlfriend and continuing his education. By all accounts, he was a young man with much to live for and much to give. Perhaps what makes cases like Brian's so compelling is that they remind us of life's fundamental uncertainty. In our modern world of digital footprints and constant connectivity, it seems impossible that someone could simply vanish. Yet Brian's case shows us that even with security cameras, cell phone records, and intensive investigations, mysteries remain. For those who knew and loved Brian Schaefer, the rain has never truly stopped. They have lived for years in the midst of uncertainty, catching glimpses of possibility in reported sightings and potential leads, only to return to questions without answers. If you're still awake and listening, I hope this exploration of this case has been informative while also providing a soothing background for sleep. Please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Our story begins on a chilly December morning in 2010. The air was crisp with winter's approach, and the beaches of Long Island's South Shore stood empty of the summer crowds. The Atlantic Ocean stretched gray and restless against the horizon as Suffolk County Police Officer John Malia and his canine partner, Blue, conducted a routine training exercise near Gilgo Beach. Gilgo Beach is part of a narrow barrier island along the southern shore of Long Island, connected to the mainland by the Ocean Parkway, a road that runs along the coastline. This strip of land is mostly undeveloped, with dense underbrush, marshy areas, and beach grass covering much of the terrain. In summer, it attracts beachgoers and vacationers, but in winter, it becomes a desolate stretch of sand and scrub. Officer Malia wasn't looking for human remains that day. He was simply training Blue for cadaver detection, a routine exercise. As they moved through the thick brambles near the roadside, about 500 feet from Ocean Parkway, Blue's behavior suddenly changed. The dog had detected something. Following his partner's signals, Officer Malia pushed through the tangled beach vegetation and made a grim discovery: human skeletal remains wrapped in a burlap sack. The Suffolk County Police Department quickly secured the area and began a careful search of the surrounding brush. What started as a training exercise had suddenly become a crime scene investigation. But no one could have anticipated what would follow. Within days, 3 more sets of remains were discovered along the same quarter-mile stretch of Ocean Parkway. All were wrapped in similar burlap material, all positioned similarly, suggesting they had been placed there by the same individual. These first 4 victims were found between December 11 and December 13, 2010. They would later be identified as Melissa Barthelemy, Amber Lynn Costello, Megan Waterman, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, all women in their 20s who had worked as escorts and had advertised their services on Craigslist. Each had been missing for between 1 and 3 years by the time their remains were discovered. Melissa Barthélemy, 24, had disappeared from her Bronx apartment in July 2009. She had last told a friend she was meeting a client near where she lived. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, was last seen in Manhattan in July 2007. Megan Waterman, 22, had traveled from her home in Maine to Long Island in June 2010 and vanished after leaving a hotel in Hauppauge. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, had last been seen leaving her home in North Babylon, Long Island, in September 2010 to meet a client. The discovery of 4 bodies in such close proximity, all young women with similar backgrounds, immediately suggested the work of a serial killer. The press quickly dubbed the unknown perpetrator the Long Island serial killer, or the Gilgo Beach killer, and the case captured national attention. Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer announced that they were dealing with a serial killer who had been operating undetected for years. As winter gave way to spring in 2011, police returned to the area with cadaver dogs, helicopters equipped with infrared technology, and dozens of searchers combing through the dense underbrush along Ocean Parkway. The search expanded eastward from Gilgo Beach across the narrow barrier island. Between March and April 2011, this expanded search uncovered 6 more sets of remains along Ocean Parkway, stretching from Gilgo Beach to Jones Beach State Park. These discoveries significantly complicated the investigation, as they appeared to represent different victims and potentially different killers. On March 29, 2011, investigators found the remains of Jessica Taylor, 20, near Gilgo Beach. Her partial remains had been previously discovered in Manorville, Long Island, in 2003, some 40 miles away. The connection between these 2 locations suggested the killer had a pattern of dismembering victims and disposing of their remains across different locations. That same day, the skeletal remains of an unidentified Asian male wearing women's clothing were discovered. Estimated to be between 17 and 23 years old, he appeared to have died by blunt force trauma. This victim, still unidentified today, became known as Asian male or John Doe No. 8 in case documents. On April 4, 2011, 3 more sets of remains were found. One was a female toddler, approximately 2 years old, wrapped in a blanket. DNA testing would later reveal she was the daughter of another victim, known as Jane Doe No. 3, or Peaches, whose partial remains had been found in Hempstead Lake State Park in 1997, and whose additional remains were among those discovered during the 2011 search. The connection between mother and daughter added another layer of tragedy to an already complex case. Also discovered on April 4 were the partial remains of a woman later connected to skeletal remains found in Manorville in 2000. She would eventually be identified in 2022 as Valerie Mack, who had disappeared from Port Republic, New Jersey in 2000 when she was 24 years old. The final remains found during this period belonged to an unidentified female, known only as Jane Doe No. 7. Her connection to the other victims remains unclear. By the end of the expanded search, investigators had discovered the remains of at least 10 individuals along this stretch of Ocean Parkway. The varying conditions of the remains, different methods of disposal, and wide timeframe suggested possibilities that were both simple and complex. Either multiple killers had used this remote area as a dumping ground over many years, or a single killer had evolved their methods over a long period of activity. As the forensic work continued, investigators began piecing together the lives of the identified victims, looking for connections beyond their shared profession. They all had advertised escort services on Craigslist or similar platforms. Most had disappeared after telling someone they were meeting a client. None showed obvious signs of drug overdose, though toxicology was difficult given the condition of the remains. The search for answers in this case actually predated the Gilgo Beach discoveries. In May 2010, a young woman named Shannon Gilbert disappeared in Oak Beach, a gated community just a few miles east of where the bodies would later be found. Shannon, a 24-year-old escort from Jersey City, New Jersey, had arranged to meet a client, Joseph Brewer, at his Oak Beach home in the early morning hours of May 1, 2010. According to records, Shannon arrived at Brewer's home with her driver, Michael Pack, waiting outside. Sometime around 5 a.m., something went terribly wrong. Shannon made a frantic 23-minute call to 911, saying repeatedly, "They're trying to kill me." She then fled Brewer's house on foot, knocking on the doors of several neighbors, including an elderly resident named Gustav Coletti and another neighbor, Barbara Brennan. When Coletti answered his door around 4:45 a.m., he found a distraught young woman who said she was in danger. He told her he would call police, and went inside to get his phone. When he returned, Shannon had vanished into the night. Michael Pack, her driver, had been searching for her but couldn't locate her in the darkness. Local security guard Gus Coletti reported seeing Shannon running down the street, appearing terrified. It was actually the search for Shannon that eventually led to the discovery of the other victims. Yet ironically, Shannon's remains were not among those found in December 2010 or in the subsequent searches in early 2011. Her disappearance remained unsolved even as the larger investigation into the Long Island serial killer took shape. Suffolk County Police initially focused their investigation on individuals connected to the escort business and those living in the Oak Beach area. Joseph Brewer, the client Shannon Gilbert had met that night, was questioned but later cleared. Others who had interacted with Shannon that night, including her driver and residents who had seen her, were also investigated and ultimately not considered suspects. As detectives dug deeper into the backgrounds of the identified victims, they began to compile a profile of the potential killer. Based on the methodical disposal of bodies, the selection of an isolated dumping ground, and the targeting of escorts, investigators believed they were looking for someone familiar with the South Shore of Long Island, someone who understood law enforcement procedures, and someone who could gain the trust of these young women. One of the most chilling aspects of this case emerged in January 2010, months after Melissa Barthelomy's disappearance but before any bodies had been discovered. Melissa's teenage sister, Amanda, began receiving a series of disturbing phone calls from an unidentified male caller using Melissa's cell phone. The first call came just days after Melissa vanished in July 2009. "Is this Melissa's little sister?" the caller asked. When Amanda confirmed that she was, the caller said, "I just wanted you to know that Melissa is a whore." The calls continued over the next 6 weeks, with the caller taunting Amanda and eventually claiming responsibility for Melissa's death. During one call, the person described the terrible things he had done to her sister in explicit detail. In another, he threatened that Amanda would be next. Each call lasted less than 3 minutes, too brief for police to effectively trace, and came from locations around Midtown Manhattan, particularly near Madison Square Garden and Times Square. NYPD detectives, who were handling Melissa's missing person case before the discovery of her remains, worked with Amanda to gather information from these calls. The caller seemed knowledgeable about police procedures, ending calls before they could be traced. He appeared to be watching news coverage of Melissa's disappearance, as he referenced details that had been reported in the media. These calls provide rare insight into the mind of a potential serial killer. The caller clearly enjoyed the power and control he exercised, both over his victims and their loved ones. The taunting of family members is uncommon even among serial offenders, suggesting someone with extreme confidence or an unusual need to extend the suffering beyond the original victim. Investigators attempted to use cellular data to identify the caller's movements, narrowing down potential locations where he might have placed the calls. Security camera footage from these areas was reviewed, but in the crowded streets of Midtown Manhattan, identifying a single individual proved impossible without more specific information. The calls to Amanda Barthelemy stopped in August 2009, as mysteriously as they had begun. By this time, the caller may have already claimed additional victims. Maureen Brainerd Barnes had disappeared in 2007, but Megan Waterman and Amber Lynn Costello vanished in June and September of 2010, respectively, after the calls to Amanda had ceased. This timeline suggests the killer may have realized the risk posed by using victims' phones and adapted his methods accordingly. It's a pattern seen in many serial offender cases, an evolution of tactics to avoid detection while continuing to satisfy dark urges. Throughout 2011, as the investigation into the Gilgo Beach victims continued, the family of Shannan Gilbert grew increasingly frustrated with the pace of the search for their loved one. Despite the discovery of multiple victims along Ocean Parkway, Shannan's remains had not been found, and her case remained classified as a missing person investigation rather than a homicide. Mari Gilbert, Shannan's mother, became a vocal advocate, pushing for more resources to be dedicated to finding her daughter. She held press conferences, organized searches, and publicly criticized the Suffolk County Police Department for what she perceived as a lack of urgency in Shannan's case. On December 13, 2011, nearly 19 months after Shannan's disappearance and a year after the first Gilgo Beach victims were found, police announced they had discovered female remains in a marshy area near Oak Beach. Days later, these remains were positively identified as Shannan Gilbert through dental records. The location where Shannan was found was less than half a mile from where she was last seen alive, in the marshy area between Oak Beach and Gilgo Beach. She had apparently run through the darkness, perhaps disoriented, and stumbled into the treacherous marsh. Her belongings, a cell phone, jeans, shoes, and purse, were found scattered along a path leading toward where her body was recovered. The Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office ruled Shannan's death as undetermined, meaning they could neither confirm nor rule out homicide, suicide, accidental death, or natural causes. Police Commissioner Richard Dormer publicly stated his belief that Shannan's death was accidental, suggesting she had become disoriented in the marsh and succumbed to the elements or drowned. This conclusion disappointed and angered the Gilbert family, who remained convinced that Shannan was a victim of foul play, possibly connected to the same killer responsible for the other Gilgo Beach victims. They pointed to the 911 call in which Shannan clearly expressed fear for her life, repeatedly saying someone was trying to kill her. The Gilbert family commissioned an independent autopsy by noted forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden. In 2016, Dr. Baden announced his findings, suggesting that Shannan's death was consistent with homicidal strangulation. He noted that the hyoid bone in her neck was fractured, an injury often associated with strangulation, though he acknowledged that this could also occur during the decomposition process. The Suffolk County Police maintained their position that Shannan's death was likely not connected to the Gilgo Beach killer, pointing to significant differences in how her body was found compared to the other victims. Unlike the others, Shannan was not wrapped in burlap or deliberately concealed, and her remains were found in a location consistent with someone fleeing in panic through unfamiliar terrain at night. This disagreement about Shannan's fate highlights the complexities of the entire Gilgo Beach investigation. Was her death truly separate from the others, a tragic accident that coincidentally led to the discovery of a serial killer's dumping ground? Or was she indeed another victim, whose death followed a different pattern for reasons unknown? As the investigation entered its second year, it faced numerous challenges that would hamper progress and frustrate both investigators and the families of victims. These challenges ranged from jurisdictional complexities to changes in leadership and contradictory theories about the case. The investigation spanned multiple jurisdictions, including Suffolk County, Nassau County, and New York City. The remains had been found in both Suffolk and Nassau counties, while several victims had disappeared from New York City. This necessitated cooperation between different police departments, each with their own protocols and resources. In December 2011, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer publicly stated his belief that a single killer was responsible for all the Gilgo Beach victims. This contradicted earlier statements from the district attorney's office suggesting that multiple killers might have used the area as a dumping ground over many years. Adding to the confusion, in January 2012, Suffolk County Executive Steve Belloni appointed a new police commissioner, Edward Weber, who brought in a new team to oversee the investigation. This change in leadership meant new eyes on the evidence but also potential delays as the new team familiarized themselves with the complex case. The investigation was further complicated by the varying conditions of the remains. Some victims had been dead for only a few months when discovered, while others had been deceased for years or even decades. This made determining exact cause of death difficult in many cases and limited the forensic evidence available. The killer's apparent knowledge of police procedures also presented challenges. The use of prepaid, disposable phones for contacting victims, the careful selection of meeting locations, and the methodical disposal of bodies all suggested someone familiar with how homicide investigations work. Some speculated the killer might have a background in law enforcement or a related field. Another significant hurdle was the stigma associated with the victim's profession. Because many of the identified victims had worked as escorts, their disappearances had not initially generated the level of media attention or investigative resources that might have been allocated to other missing persons. Family members of several victims reported feeling that their loved ones' cases weren't taken seriously until the connection to a serial killer became apparent. By 2013, the initial media frenzy had subsided, but the investigation continued quietly. Police pursued various leads, including examining cell phone records, reviewing hours of surveillance footage, and analyzing forensic evidence. Yet no arrests were made, and no suspects were publicly identified. The families of victims formed support networks, holding annual memorials and keeping pressure on authorities to continue the investigation. Organizations advocating for sex workers' rights also became involved, highlighting how the marginalization of these women may have made them targets and pointing out systemic failures in protecting vulnerable populations. Throughout the investigation, several individuals have drawn attention as potential persons of interest, though it's important to note that no one has been charged with these crimes as of this recording. I'll discuss some individuals who have been publicly connected to the case, while emphasizing that mention of these names does not imply guilt. One early person of interest was Joseph Brewer, the client who had hired Shannon Gilbert on the night of her disappearance. Police questioned Brewer extensively and searched his home in Oak Beach. However, he was eventually cleared, with investigators finding no evidence connecting him to Gilbert's death or to any of the other victims. Dr. Peter Hackett, a former emergency services physician living in Oak Beach, also drew scrutiny after Mari Gilbert, Shannon's mother, claimed he had called her shortly after Shannon's disappearance, saying he had found Shannon disoriented, taken her into his home, and given her medication to calm her down. Hackett initially denied making this call, but phone records later confirmed he had indeed called the Gilbert family twice in the days following Shannon's disappearance. When questioned about this discrepancy, Hackett changed his story several times. Despite the suspicious circumstances, investigators found no evidence directly linking him to any crimes. In December 2015, the FBI officially joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and a fresh perspective. With their involvement, attention turned to James Burke, the former Suffolk County Police Chief who had resigned earlier that year amid a scandal involving the beating of a suspect in an unrelated case. Some reports suggested Burke had deliberately blocked FBI involvement in the Gilgo Beach investigation for years. In 2016, Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for civil rights violations and conspiracy related to the beating case, but no connection to the Gilgo Beach murders was ever established. John Bitrolf, a carpenter from Manorville, Long Island, became another person of interest after his 2014 arrest for the murders of two women in the 1990s. Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee, both of whom had worked as prostitutes, were killed in 1993 and 1994 respectively. Their bodies were discovered in wooded areas of Long Island, posed similarly to each other. In 2017, Bittrolf was convicted of these murders and sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Some investigators noted similarities between the Tangredi and McNamee murders and the Gilgo Beach cases, particularly the victims' professions and the disposal of bodies in secluded areas. Additionally, Bittrolf lived in Manorville, near where partial remains of 2 Gilgo victims had been found years earlier. However, no charges have been filed against Bittrolf in connection with the Gilgo Beach cases, and police have not publicly named him as a suspect. In early 2020, investigators released a photograph of a black leather belt embossed with the letters HM or WH, depending on orientation. They believed this belt was handled by the killer and did not belong to any of the victims. This was the first piece of physical evidence publicly revealed in nearly a decade, suggesting the investigation remained active. After years of slow progress and few public developments, the case saw a major breakthrough in July 2023 when authorities arrested Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect living in Massapequa Park, Long Island. Heuermann was charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo 4 victims, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. He was also named as the prime suspect in the death of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, though charges in her case were pending further evidence at the time of his arrest. Heuermann had lived for decades in the same modest house on First Avenue in Massapequa Park, a middle-class suburb on Long Island's South Shore, approximately 20 minutes from Gilgo Beach. He ran an architecture firm in Manhattan and commuted regularly to his office on Fifth Avenue. Married with 2 children, Heuermann presented as an ordinary professional and family man to neighbors, though some described him as creepy or unsettling in retrospect. The break in the case came through advances in DNA technology and cell phone data analysis. According to court documents, a male hair found on the burlap used to wrap Megan Waterman's body was determined to be from someone sharing Rex Heuermann's paternal lineage. Investigators obtained a sample of Heuermann's DNA from a pizza crust he discarded and confirmed the match. Cell phone records also placed Heuermann in the vicinity of locations where the victims disappeared and where the taunting calls to Melissa Barthelemy's sister were made. Additionally, investigators discovered that Heuermann had conducted numerous online searches related to the case and for sadistic pornography involving scenes similar to how the victims were treated. Another crucial piece of evidence came from Heuermann's wife's hair, which was found on or near 3 of the victims. Investigators noted that Heuermann's wife and children were out of town when each of the Gilgo 4 disappeared, suggesting he committed the murders when his family was away. The arrest of Rex Heuermann came after a task force was formed in 2022 to reinvigorate the investigation. Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney, who took office in January 2022, assembled a team that included Suffolk County Police detectives, New York State Police investigators, and FBI agents. This task force took a fresh look at the evidence, particularly focusing on connections between cell phone data and DNA evidence that had been collected years earlier. Following Heuermann's arrest, police conducted an extensive search of his home, removing numerous items including a large collection of firearms. Authorities continued searching the property for several weeks, looking for any evidence connecting Heuermann to other unsolved cases. In the press conference announcing Heuermann's arrest, officials emphasized that the investigation remained ongoing, particularly regarding the other sets of remains found along Ocean Parkway. While Heuermann was specifically charged with the murders of the Gilgo 4, investigators continued to explore possible connections to the other victims. For the families who had waited over a decade for answers, the arrest brought a mix of emotions, relief that a suspect had finally been identified, but also renewed grief as the details of the crimes were made public. The sisters, brothers, parents, and children of the victims expressed gratitude to the investigators who had never given up on finding justice for their loved ones. Throughout the years before Hoyerman's arrest, numerous theories emerged about the Long Island serial killer case, reflecting both the complexity of the evidence and the human tendency to seek patterns in chaotic events. Criminologists, forensic psychologists, and amateur sleuths all contributed to a growing body of speculation about who might be responsible for these murders. One prevailing theory suggested the killer had significant knowledge of law enforcement techniques, possibly even being a current or former police officer. This theory gained traction due to several factors: the killer's apparent understanding of how to avoid leaving forensic evidence, the strategic placement of bodies in areas that would be difficult to search, and the calculated use of victims' cell phones in ways that minimize the risk of being traced. The theory of a killer with connections to law enforcement seemed bolstered by reports that former Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke had blocked FBI assistance in the case for years. While never officially named as a suspect, the questions surrounding Burke's handling of the investigation fed conspiracy theories and suspicion. Another theory focused on the geography of the case. The use of remote locations along Ocean Parkway, as well as the connection to Manorville, where partial remains of some victims were found, suggested someone intimately familiar with Long Island's landscape, particularly its more isolated areas. This pointed to a local resident rather than someone from New York City or elsewhere. Some investigators proposed that different groups of victims might be attributed to different killers. The Gilgo Four, all petite women in their 20s who worked as escorts and were wrapped in burlap, shared clear similarities. But other victims, such as the unidentified Asian male or the female toddler, presented different victim profiles and disposal methods, suggesting they might be the work of another offender. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman in 2023 confirmed some aspects of these theories while contradicting others. As an architect who had lived on Long Island for decades, Hoyerman indeed possessed intimate knowledge of the area. His professional background gave him an understanding of structures and land use that might have informed his selection of disposal sites. However, Hoyerman was not a law enforcement officer, though as a professional working in New York City, he likely had awareness of police procedures through general knowledge and media coverage. His apparent ability to compartmentalize his life, maintaining a professional career and family life while allegedly committing horrific crimes, aligns with patterns seen in other serial killers who maintain seemingly normal facades. The charging documents against Hoyerman revealed that he had allegedly conducted extensive research on the case, including following news coverage and searching for information about the victims and the investigation. This suggests a perpetrator who was not only aware of the impact of his actions but derived satisfaction from the public response and the suffering of victims' families, consistent with the taunting phone calls made to Melissa Barthelomy's sister years earlier. While Hoyerman has been charged with 3 of the Gilgo Four murders and named as the prime suspect in the 4th, questions remain about the other victims found along Ocean Parkway. The investigation continues to determine whether these deaths are connected or represent separate cases that coincidentally shared a dumping ground. Throughout this case, there has been a tendency in media coverage and public discourse to focus on the sensational aspects of the investigation while reducing the victims to footnotes in their own stories. But each person discovered along Ocean Parkway had a life, loved ones who mourned them, and dreams that were cut short. Melissa Bartholomew, 24, was described by her family as independent and ambitious. Originally from Buffalo, New York, she had moved to the Bronx to pursue opportunities and was saving money to open her own beauty salon. She regularly sent money home to help her family and stayed in close contact with her mother and sister. Her family described her as street-smart and cautious, making her disappearance all the more shocking to those who knew her. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, was a mother of 2 young children from Norwich, Connecticut. Friends described her as intelligent and an avid reader who wrote poetry. She had worked various jobs, including as a waitress and at a grocery store, before turning to escort work temporarily to pay her rent and avoid eviction. Her family emphasized that she was a devoted mother who was doing what she felt necessary to provide for her children. Megan Waterman, 22, from South Portland, Maine, was also a mother. Her daughter was just 3 years old when Megan disappeared. Family members described her as loving and funny, with a particular talent for making others laugh. She had planned to return to school and was working to build a stable future for herself and her daughter. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, had struggled with addiction but was described by friends as generous and kind-hearted. Originally from North Carolina, she had moved to Long Island and was living with roommates in West Babylon. Despite her personal challenges, she was known for helping others whenever she could, often sharing what little she had with those in need. Valerie Mack, identified in 2020 through genetic genealogy after being known only as Jane Doe No. 6 for many years, was 24 when she disappeared in 2000. She had a son and had been working in Philadelphia before her disappearance. Family members who provided DNA that helped identify her remains spoke of finally having answers after 2 decades of uncertainty. Jessica Taylor, 20, had been living in New York City and working in the Washington, D.C. area before her disappearance in 2003. Friends remembered her as vibrant and outgoing, with a distinctive laugh that would fill a room. For the victims who remain unidentified, advocacy groups continue to work with authorities to determine their identities and notify their families, who may still be searching for answers about loved ones who vanished years or even decades ago. The tragedy of these cases extends beyond the individuals who lost their lives. Each death created ripples of grief that affected parents, siblings, children, and friends. Children grew up without mothers. Parents aged without knowing what happened to their daughters and sons. Siblings carried the weight of loss and the burden of seeking justice for those they loved. Organizations supporting the investigation, such as the Long Island Serial Killer Victims Family Support Group, have worked to ensure that the public remembers the humanity of those who were lost. They have held vigils, created memorials, and advocated for continued attention to the case even when media interest waned. Following Rex Heuermann's arrest in July 2023, the investigation entered a new phase. Prosecutors built their case against Heuermann for the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, while gathering additional evidence regarding Maureen Brainerd Barnes and potentially other victims. In the months after his arrest, investigators conducted thorough searches of Heuermann's home in Massapequa Park, his office in Manhattan, and other properties connected to him, including a storage unit. These searches yielded hundreds of pieces of potential evidence, including electronic devices, firearms, and other items that might connect him to the murders. Prosecutors revealed that Heuermann's digital footprint included searches for information about the Gilgo Beach investigation, as well as searches for explicit content involving torture, rape, and murder. They also found that he had looked up information about the victims' families and the ongoing investigation, suggesting a continued interest in his alleged crimes years after they were committed. DNA analysis remained central to the case against Heuermann. In addition to the male hair found on burlap used to wrap Megan Waterman's body, investigators continued analyzing other physical evidence collected from the various crime scenes. The scale of this forensic work was immense, involving dozens of specialists and multiple laboratories. The task force formed in 2022 also revisited evidence from other unsolved cases across Long Island, looking for potential connections to Heuermann or similar signature elements. This included missing persons cases dating back decades and unsolved homicides with similar victim profiles or circumstances. In particular, investigators continued examining the other remains found along Ocean Parkway during the 2010 to 2011 searches. While Heuermann was specifically charged with crimes related to the Gilgo 4, questions remained about whether he might be connected to any of the other victims discovered in the area. The case of Shannon Gilbert, whose disappearance had inadvertently led to the discovery of the other victims, remained classified as an accidental death by Suffolk County Police. However, the Gilbert family continued their fight to have her case reclassified as a homicide investigation. Shannon's mother, Mari Gilbert, had been a vocal advocate for this cause until her own tragic death in 2016, when she was murdered by her other daughter, Sarah, who suffered from schizophrenia. Following Mari's death, Shannon's sisters, Cher and Sarah, before her incarceration, continued advocating for a new investigation into Shannon's case. The arrest of a suspect after so many years brought renewed public interest in the case. Documentaries, podcasts, and books explored the long investigation, the lives of the victims, and the communities affected by these crimes. This media attention helped keep pressure on authorities to continue pursuing justice for all the victims found along Ocean Parkway, not just those directly linked to Hoyerman. For many Long Island residents, especially those living near Gilgo Beach or in Massapequa Park, the arrest of someone who had lived among them for decades was deeply unsettling. Community forums and support groups formed to help process the collective trauma of having a suspected serial killer as a neighbor. Local officials worked to reassure residents while acknowledging the profound impact of these revelations on their sense of security. The Gilgo Beach case has been the subject of intense media scrutiny since the first bodies were discovered in December 2010. The emergence of a potential serial killer operating in the shadows of New York, one of the most heavily populated and policed areas in the country, captured public imagination and fear in equal measure. Initial coverage focused on the shocking discovery of multiple victims along a desolate stretch of beach. News helicopters hovered over Ocean Parkway, capturing footage of police officers combing through thick brush. Press conferences by Suffolk County police officials became major events, with journalists from across the country descending on Long Island to cover each new development. The case spawned numerous documentaries, including A&E's The Killing Season, 2016, Netflix's Lost Girls, 2020, and Investigation Discoveries, The Long Island Serial Killer, A Mother's Hunt for Justice, 2021. Each approached the case from different angles, some focusing on the investigation itself, others on the victims and their families, and some examining the broader societal issues highlighted by the case. Podcasts dedicated to the Lisk case proliferated as the true crime genre gained popularity. Shows like Unraveled, Long Island Serial Killer, and Lisk, Long Island Serial Killer, drew substantial audiences, with amateur sleuths and armchair detectives developing their own theories about the perpetrator's identity. Some of these podcasts worked closely with victims' families, helping to keep pressure on law enforcement to continue the investigation. Books such as Robert Coker's Lost Girls, An Unsolved American Mystery, 2013, provided in-depth examinations of the case, focusing particularly on the lives of the identified victims and societal factors that may have contributed to their vulnerability. Coker's work was later adapted into the Netflix film Lost Girls, starring Amy Ryan as Mari Gilbert, Shannon's mother. The media's approach to covering the victims evolved over time. Early reporting often emphasized their work as escorts, sometimes in ways that seemed to diminish their humanity. This prompted criticism from victims' advocates and families, who pushed for more respectful coverage that acknowledged the full lives of those who had been killed. Later reporting generally made more effort to portray the victims as complex individuals with dreams, relationships, and identities beyond how they had earned money. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman in July 2023 generated another wave of intense media coverage. News outlets broadcast live from outside his Massapequa Park home as police conducted their search. Neighbors were interviewed about their impressions of the man who had lived among them for decades while allegedly committing horrific crimes. Former clients of his architecture firm and people who had interacted with him professionally expressed shock at the revelations. This case has also highlighted changing approaches to true crime coverage. Earlier reporting sometimes sensationalized the gruesome details while giving less attention to systemic issues that make certain populations more vulnerable to violence. More recent coverage has increasingly examined factors like the inadequate response to missing persons reports involving sex workers, the limitations of interjurisdictional police cooperation, and the role of online platforms in both enabling dangerous situations and potentially providing evidence for investigations. Public fascination with the case reflects broader cultural interests in unsolved mysteries and true crime narratives, but also genuine concern about justice for the victims and their families. Online communities dedicated to discussing the case have sometimes contributed meaningful insights, though they have also occasionally spread misinformation or unfounded speculation. Behind the headlines, press conferences, and true crime documentaries, the Long Island serial killer case represents profound personal tragedies for dozens of families. For years, many lived in agonizing limbo, knowing their loved ones were missing but not knowing their fate. The discoveries along Ocean Parkway brought the worst possible news but also a strange form of closure that allowed the grieving process to formally begin. For the families of the Gilgo Four, the 2023 arrest of Rex Heuermann marked a significant milestone in their long journey toward justice. Linda Barthelemy, Melissa's mother, had passed away in 2022, never knowing who had allegedly taken her daughter's life. Melissa's sister Amanda, who had endured those horrifying phone calls in 2009, was present for Heuermann's arraignment, finally seeing the face of the man accused of her sister's murder. The family of Maureen Brainerd Barnes expressed mixed emotions, relief that a suspect had been identified but renewed grief as details of the investigation became public. Maureen's children, who had grown up without their mother, faced the difficult task of processing new information about her final days. Her sister, Melissa Cann, had become an advocate for the victims over the years, working to ensure that Maureen would be remembered for more than just how she died. Lorraine Ella, Megan Waterman's mother, spoke of finally having answers after 13 years of questions. Megan's daughter, who was just a toddler when her mother disappeared, had grown into a teenager by the time of Heuermann's arrest. The milestone events of her life, birthdays, school achievements, coming of age, had all occurred without her mother present. The family of Amber Lynn Costello described the arrest as bittersweet. Nothing could bring Amber back, but knowing that someone would potentially be held accountable provided a measure of peace. Her sister, Kimberly Overstreet, had become an outspoken advocate for sex workers' rights in the years following Amber's death, arguing that societal stigma had contributed to the vulnerability of all the victims. For the families of victims whose deaths have not yet been linked to Heuermann, questions remain. They continue to wait and hope that ongoing investigations will provide answers and justice for their loved ones as well. The Oak Beach community, where Shannon Gilbert disappeared, and the Massapequa Park neighborhood, where Rex Heuermann lived for decades, have both been profoundly affected by their connections to this case. Residents describe a loss of innocence and a new wariness, the unsettling realization that darkness can hide behind the most ordinary facades. In the years since the discoveries at Gilgo Beach, various advocacy groups have emerged, working to address issues highlighted by this case. Organizations focusing on sex workers' rights have pointed to the need for better safety measures and reduced stigma that prevents many from seeking help when in danger. Missing persons advocacy groups have pushed for improved protocols in responding to disappearances, particularly for adults who may be incorrectly dismissed as having left voluntarily. The use of genetic genealogy to identify Valerie Mack after 2 decades represents a technological advancement that has revolutionized cold case investigations. The combination of cell phone data analysis and DNA evidence that led to Heuermann's arrest demonstrates how older evidence can be re-examined with new techniques to yield results. As our journey through this complex and tragic case comes to an end, the rain in our background continues its gentle rhythm, a reminder of life's ongoing cycles even in the face of darkness. The Long Island serial killer case represents not just a series of horrific crimes but also the resilience of families who never stopped seeking answers, investigators who never abandoned the search for justice, and communities that continue to honor the memories of those who were lost. The shores of Gilgo Beach now stand as a solemn memorial to lives cut short. Where holiday beachgoers once spread their towels in summer sun, small markers and occasional flowers left by mourners remind us of the human cost of violence. Yet even in this place of sadness, there is hope, hope that justice, however delayed, can still be served, hope that sharing these stories might prevent future tragedies, hope that remembering the victims as complete human beings rather than statistics honors the fullness of the lives they lived. As you drift toward sleep, I hope you carry with you not the darkness of this story but the light of human perseverance, the determined investigators who never gave up, the families who kept memories alive, the advocates who worked to protect others from similar fates. In even the most troubling true crime cases, we find examples of remarkable human compassion, dedication, and the deep desire for justice that connects us all. The investigation continues, with prosecutors building their case against Rex Heuermann and investigators still working to determine connections to other unsolved cases. For some families, questions remain. For others, the long wait for answers has finally ended, though the pain of loss will never fully heal. If you're still awake and listening, I hope this exploration of this case has been informative while also providing a soothing background for sleep. Please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. Brandon Lawson was born in 1986 and grew up in West Texas. Standing at 5 feet 9 inches with a medium build, brown hair, and brown eyes, Brandon was known for his hard work and dedication to his family. By August 2013, Brandon was living in San Angelo, Texas, with his longtime girlfriend, Ledessa Lofton, and their children. Brandon worked in the oil fields of West Texas, a demanding job that required long hours in challenging conditions. The oil industry in West Texas has been a significant economic driver for generations, with workers like Brandon forming the backbone of this crucial industry. The work was physically demanding, with shifts often lasting 12 hours or more in the intense Texas heat. Despite the challenges of his job, Brandon was devoted to his family. Friends and family described him as a loving father who worked hard to provide for his children. He and Ledessa had been together for nearly a decade, building a life together in San Angelo, a city of around 100,000 people located about 200 miles southwest of Dallas. San Angelo sits at the junction of the Concho rivers in a region known as the Concho Valley. It's a city with deep historical roots, originally established as a frontier settlement around Fort Concho in the late 1860s. By 2013, it had grown into a regional center for healthcare, education, and the oil industry, while still maintaining its connection to its ranching heritage. The summer of 2013 in San Angelo was particularly hot, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees during the day and staying warm well into the evening. August is typically one of the hottest months in West Texas, with the landscape appearing parched and the vegetation turned golden brown under the relentless sun. Brandon and Ledessa's home was modest but comfortable, located in a neighborhood where families knew one another. Their children attended local schools, and the couple had established connections within their community through work, school, and family activities. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Brandon had been working particularly long shifts. According to Ledessa, on August 8, 2013, Brandon had come home from work tired and stressed. The couple had argued that evening, a disagreement that, in hindsight, would take on much greater significance than either could have imagined at the time. Following their argument, Brandon decided to leave the house to cool off. This wasn't entirely unusual. Sometimes when tensions rose, one or the other would take some time apart to collect their thoughts. Brandon told Ledessa he was going to visit his father in Crowley, Texas, approximately 350 miles away. Around 11:30 p.m. on that Thursday night, Brandon left their home in his pickup truck, a silver 1998 Ford F-150. He was wearing a yellow shirt, camouflage shorts, and white sneakers. Before leaving, he packed a small bag and made sure he had his wallet and cell phone. What neither Brandon nor Ledessa knew was that this ordinary argument would be the beginning of an enduring mystery, one that would lead to countless searches, theories, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. As midnight approached on August 8, Brandon was driving his truck along Highway 277, heading north from San Angelo. The highway at night was typically quiet, with only occasional traffic passing through the rural landscape. The route would take him through Bronte, a small town of fewer than 1,000 residents, before continuing toward Abilene. At approximately 11:54 p.m., Brandon called his brother, Kyle Lawson, who also lived in San Angelo. During this call, Brandon mentioned that he was running low on gas and asked if Kyle could bring him some fuel. Kyle agreed to help and began preparing to meet his brother. About 20 minutes later, at 12:10 a.m. on August 9, Brandon placed a call to 911, the recording of which would later become a central piece of evidence in understanding what might have happened to him. The call, which lasted approximately 43 seconds, is difficult to decipher clearly, but Brandon sounded distressed. In the call, Brandon told the dispatcher, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. Just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Abilene on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy's chasing me through the woods. Please hurry." When the dispatcher asked if he needed an ambulance, Brandon's response included what sounded like, "No, I need the cops." The call then disconnected. The 911 dispatcher attempted to call Brandon back, but there was no answer. The dispatcher then contacted the Coke County Sheriff's Office to report the call. Meanwhile, Kyle and his girlfriend had set out to help Brandon with the gas. They drove north on Highway 277, looking for Brandon's truck. At approximately 12:30 a.m., they spotted Brandon's silver Ford F-150 parked on the side of the highway, about 4 miles north of Bronte. The truck was positioned slightly off the roadway, as if it had been carefully pulled over. The driver's door was closed, and there was no sign of Brandon anywhere in the vicinity. Kyle noticed that the truck appeared to be out of gas, just as Brandon had mentioned. As Kyle was inspecting the vehicle, a Coke County Sheriff's deputy arrived on the scene. The deputy had been dispatched in response to the 911 call but was not aware that the call had come from Brandon. When Kyle explained that the truck belonged to his missing brother, the deputy ran the license plate to confirm ownership. Because the truck was positioned in a way that could potentially create a traffic hazard, the deputy arranged for it to be towed. Kyle, still concerned about his brother's whereabouts, tried calling Brandon's cell phone multiple times, but there was no answer. After the truck was towed, Kyle returned to San Angelo and informed Ledessa about the situation. By this point, it was the early morning hours of August 9, and concern for Brandon was growing. As dawn broke on August 9, Ledessa began calling hospitals, jails, and police stations, hoping to find some information about Brandon. When these calls yielded no results, she officially reported him missing to the San Angelo Police Department. Due to jurisdictional considerations, the investigation was primarily handled by the Coke County Sheriff's Office, as Brandon's truck had been found in their jurisdiction. However, multiple agencies would eventually become involved in the search. The initial search focused on the area surrounding the location where Brandon's truck had been found. The landscape in this part of Texas is characterized by gently rolling hills, scattered mesquite trees, and dense brush in some areas. The terrain can be challenging to navigate, with hidden ravines and uneven ground that can make searching difficult. Law enforcement officers conducted a ground search, walking through the fields and wooded areas near the highway. They were looking for any sign of Brandon or evidence that might indicate what had happened to him. Despite their efforts, the initial search did not yield any significant findings. As the investigation continued, authorities reviewed the 911 call more carefully. The mention of "some guys" and "someone" chasing me through the woods was particularly concerning. However, there were no reports of other incidents in the area that night, and it wasn't clear who these individuals might have been or what had transpired. During this initial phase of the investigation, law enforcement also spoke with Brandon's family and friends to gather more information about his state of mind and any potential reasons why he might have left the area voluntarily or why someone might have wanted to harm him. In the days following Brandon's disappearance, the search expanded significantly. Family members, friends, and volunteers joined law enforcement in combing the area around Highway 277 where his truck had been found. They searched across the rugged terrain of Coke County, an area characterized by its rural landscape and sparse population. Search teams used ATVs to cover more ground, while others walked in grid patterns through the fields and wooded areas. They were looking for any sign of Brandon, clothing, personal items, or anything that might indicate what had happened to him or where he might have gone. The Texas Department of Public Safety provided helicopter support, conducting aerial searches of the region. The helicopter was equipped with thermal imaging technology that could potentially detect a person on the ground, even in areas of dense vegetation. Despite these extensive efforts, the searches did not yield any definitive evidence related to Brandon's whereabouts. The lack of results was particularly puzzling given the open nature of much of the terrain. While there were areas of brush and some wooded sections, large portions of the landscape offered clear visibility, making it difficult to understand how someone could simply vanish without a trace. As the ground search continued, investigators began analyzing Brandon's cell phone records. These records showed that after the 911 call, Brandon had attempted to call his brother Kyle again at 12:15 a.m. This call lasted approximately 4 minutes, but Kyle later reported that the connection was poor, and the conversation was difficult to understand. The cell phone records provided valuable information about Brandon's approximate location at the time of these calls. His phone had pinged off a tower near Bronte, consistent with the location where his truck was found. However, after the 12:15 a.m. call to Kyle, there were no further outgoing calls from Brandon's phone. Interestingly, when family members continued to call Brandon's number in the hours and days after his disappearance, the phone appeared to ring rather than go straight to voicemail, suggesting that the phone might still have been powered on. However, there was no answer to any of these calls. Authorities attempted to use the cell phone signal to narrow down Brandon's potential location, but the rural area had limited coverage, making precise tracking difficult. The phone's last known location was consistent with the general area where his truck had been found, but it couldn't pinpoint his exact position or movements after that final call. As days turned into weeks with no sign of Brandon, various theories began to emerge about what might have happened to him. Some of these theories were based on the limited evidence available, while others were more speculative. One theory focused on the content of the 911 call. Brandon's mention of "some guys" and being chased suggested that he might have encountered trouble with one or more individuals. Some speculated that he might have witnessed illegal activity along the highway and been targeted as a result. Another theory considered the possibility that Brandon might have become disoriented in the dark and wandered into the surrounding countryside. August nights in West Texas can still be warm, but if he had become injured or lost, exposure to the elements could have been a serious concern. Some community members suggested that Brandon might have chosen to disappear voluntarily, perhaps due to personal or financial pressures. However, his family strongly disputed this theory, pointing to his close relationship with his children and his stable employment. Law enforcement continued to investigate all possibilities, following up on tips and reported sightings. They interviewed individuals who had been in the area that night, including truckers who regularly traveled that stretch of highway and residents of nearby properties. Despite these efforts, the case remained enigmatic, with more questions than answers. In the years since Brandon's disappearance, his family has never stopped searching for answers. Ladessa, his brother Kyle, and other family members have maintained a dedicated effort to keep his case in the public eye. They created social media pages dedicated to finding Brandon, organized additional searches of the area, and worked with various missing persons organizations to spread awareness about his case. The family offered a reward for information leading to Brandon's whereabouts, hoping that financial incentive might encourage someone with knowledge to come forward. Each year on the anniversary of his disappearance, the family holds events to remember Brandon and to remind the community that they are still seeking answers. These gatherings serve both as a memorial and as an opportunity to generate renewed interest in the case. The family has also worked with private investigators and consulted with experts in various fields, seeking fresh perspectives on the limited evidence available. Their determination to find Brandon has never wavered, despite the passage of time and the emotional toll of living with such uncertainty. In 2018, nearly 5 years after Brandon's disappearance, there was a potential breakthrough in the case. Clothing items were found in the search area that the family believed might have belonged to Brandon. However, conclusive identification proved difficult due to the condition of the items after years of exposure to the elements. In January 2022, human remains were discovered in Coke County, not far from where Brandon's truck had been found. This discovery prompted renewed interest in the case, as many wondered if these might be Brandon's remains. After careful forensic examination, authorities confirmed in February 2022 that the remains were indeed identified as Brandon Lawson. This confirmation brought a measure of closure to one aspect of the mystery. Brandon's location had finally been determined. However, many questions still remain about the circumstances of his disappearance and death. The investigation remains open, with authorities continuing to examine the evidence to determine what happened to Brandon that night in August 2013. The cause of death has not been publicly disclosed, and it's unclear whether the discovery of his remains has provided new investigative leads. Brandon Lawson's case reminds us of the fragility of human life and the profound impact that a single night can have on so many people. His disappearance left 4 children without a father and created a void in the lives of all who knew and loved him. The mystery of what happened on Highway 277 that August night has touched not only those who knew Brandon personally but also countless others who have followed his case over the years. His story serves as a poignant reminder of the thousands of missing persons cases across the country, each representing an individual with their own hopes, dreams, and loved ones waiting for answers. As we conclude this story, we honor Brandon's memory and acknowledge the ongoing efforts to understand the full truth of what happened to him. May his family find the peace and closure they have sought for so long. Story 4. In the tranquil Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California, nestled among towering pines and surrounded by breathtaking natural beauty, sits the small community once known as Keddie. It was here, on a cool April night in 1981, that an unimaginable tragedy befell the Sharp family, forever changing the lives of everyone connected to them and creating a mystery that. To understand the Keddie murders, we must first understand the place where they occurred. Keddie was not just a town but a resort community, established in the early 1900s when the Western Pacific Railroad was built through the Feather River Canyon. Located in Plumas County, California, about 85 miles northwest of Reno, Nevada, the Keddie Resort was once a thriving vacation destination. By 1981, however, the resort had fallen into disrepair. What had once been a charming getaway for the wealthy had become a collection of aging cabins rented mostly to people of modest means. The main lodge, once elegant with its stone fireplace and sweeping views, stood as a reminder of more prosperous times. The cabins, numbered 1 through 33, were scattered throughout the property, connected by dirt paths winding through the pine trees. Despite its decline, Keddie still possessed a certain rustic charm. The surrounding mountains provided a dramatic backdrop, and the nearby Feather River offered fishing and swimming opportunities. The small community of perhaps 100 residents knew one another, creating a sense of familiarity that is often found in remote rural settings. The winters in this part of California can be harsh, with heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures. But by April, the snow typically begins to melt, and the first signs of spring emerge. Wildflowers start to dot the landscape, and the days grow longer. It was during this transitional season that the Sharp family found themselves living in Cabin 28. Glenna Sue Sharp was a 36-year-old mother of 5 trying to build a new life. In late 1980, following her separation from her husband James, Sue had moved from Connecticut to California with 5 of her children. Her oldest son, John, had remained on the East Coast with his father. Sue was described by those who knew her as resilient and determined. Standing about 5 feet 6 inches with brown hair often pulled back in a practical style, she was a woman focused on providing for her children despite limited resources. Friends would later recall her kind nature and her willingness to help others even when she had little to offer. After briefly staying with family in Quincy, California, Sue found Cabin 28 at the Keddy Resort. The monthly rent of $250 was manageable, and the location offered a fresh start away from the troubles of her marriage. She moved in with her 5 children, 15-year-old John, 14-year-old Sheila, 12-year-old Tina, 10-year-old Rick, and 5-year-old Greg. Cabin 28 was a modest 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom structure with wooden walls and basic furnishings. The main room combined the living area and kitchen, with bedrooms branching off. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was a place the family could call home. The cabin was situated near the center of the resort, with neighboring cabins visible through the trees. Sue found work as a cook at a nearby nursing home in Quincy. The job didn't pay much, but it allowed her to support her family. The older children attended the local schools, where they were beginning to make friends and adjust to their new surroundings. John Sharp, Sue's 15-year-old son, was described as protective of his mother and siblings. With sandy brown hair and a lanky build, he was at that awkward age between boyhood and becoming a young man. Friends remembered him as quiet but friendly, the kind of teenager who was growing into his responsibilities as the oldest male in the household. 14-year-old Sheila was described as studious and somewhat reserved. With long, straight hair framing her face, she was navigating the challenges of adolescence while helping her mother with her younger siblings. 12-year-old Tina, with her infectious smile and outgoing personality, was known for her kindness and creativity. 10-year-old Rick and 5-year-old Greg were energetic boys, always exploring their surroundings and adjusting well to their new home. In the months leading up to April 1981, the Sharp family was beginning to establish routines and connections in their new community. Sue had made friends with some neighbors, including Marilyn Smart, who lived in nearby Cabin 26 with her husband Martin and their teenage son Justin. The children were settling into school, and despite the challenges of starting over, there seemed to be hope for their future in Keddy. The family's financial situation was tight, but they were managing. Sue was known to be careful with money, stretching her modest income to provide for her children's needs. She maintained contact with her estranged husband, James, primarily regarding matters concerning their children. As winter gave way to spring in 1981, the Sharp family was, by all accounts, adapting to their new life. There were challenges, to be sure, but nothing to suggest the tragedy that was about to unfold in their small cabin among the pines. Saturday, April 11, 1981, began as an ordinary day for the Sharp family. Sue had the day off from her job at the nursing home, allowing her some precious time with her children. The weather in Keddy that day was mild for early April, with temperatures reaching into the 60s under partly cloudy skies. That evening, Johnny Sharp invited his friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate, to spend the night at Cabin 28. Dana, a tall, athletic teenager with dark hair, lived in Quincy and had become friends with Johnny in the months since the Sharps had moved to the area. The two boys were planning to spend Sunday fishing, taking advantage of the improving spring weather. Sue's younger sons, Rick and Greg, had asked for permission to stay overnight with a family in neighboring cabin 27. Sue agreed, and the boys excitedly packed their overnight bags, looking forward to their sleepover. This meant that the occupants of cabin 28 that night would be Sue, Johnny, Dana, Sheila, and Tina. As evening approached, Sue prepared a simple dinner for those remaining in the cabin. The atmosphere was relaxed and ordinary. Sheila would later recall that they watched some television together before bedtime. There were no visitors that anyone remembered, no unusual phone calls, no indications that anything was amiss. The layout of cabin 28 placed Sue in one bedroom, Johnny and Dana in another, and Sheila and Tina sharing the third. As the evening progressed, they retired to their respective rooms. Sheila later recalled reading for a while before falling asleep with her younger sister Tina beside her. Outside the cabin, the Keddy Resort was quiet that Saturday night. Being early in the season, not all cabins were occupied. Those residents who were there went about their evening routines without noticing anything unusual. As darkness fell over the Sierra Nevada mountains, a waxing moon provided some illumination through the pine trees. Sunday morning, April 12, 1981, dawned clear and cool in Keddy. Sheila Sharp had spent the night at a friend's house for a sleepover and was returning home around 7:30 a.m. Walking up to cabin 28, everything appeared normal from the outside, there was no sign of the horror that awaited within. When Sheila opened the door to the cabin, she was immediately confronted with a scene so gruesome that it would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the living room lay the bodies of her mother Sue, her brother Johnny, and his friend Dana Wingate. They had been bound with medical tape and electrical wire, and had suffered brutal attacks with multiple weapons. In that moment of shock and terror, Sheila did what any 14-year-old would do, she ran. She fled to the neighboring cabin 27, where her younger brothers had spent the night, and the adults there immediately called for help while keeping the children away from the scene. Law enforcement response was swift. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department arrived within minutes, securing the scene and beginning what would become one of the most complex investigations in the county's history. As deputies moved through the cabin, they made another disturbing discovery: 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing from the home. The small sheriff's department, unaccustomed to crimes of this magnitude, quickly called for assistance. Investigators from neighboring jurisdictions and the California Department of Justice responded, bringing additional expertise and resources. The remote location of Keddy presented immediate challenges for the investigation. The nearest crime lab was hours away, and the technology available in 1981 was limited compared to today's forensic capabilities. As news of the murders spread through the tiny community, shock and fear took hold. Parents kept their children indoors, doors that had routinely been left unlocked were now secured, and neighbors looked at one another with new suspicion. The idyllic mountain setting had been shattered by violence of an unimaginable kind. As investigators processed the crime scene at cabin 28, they began to piece together the events of that terrible night. The physical evidence told a story of extreme violence. Sue, Johnny, and Dana had been subjected to a frenzied attack involving multiple weapons, including a knife, a hammer, and possibly others. The binding of the victim suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case immediately became apparent: there were no signs of forced entry to the cabin. This suggested that either the door had been unlocked, or the victims had willingly admitted their killers. Given the brutal nature of the attacks, investigators believed multiple perpetrators were likely involved. The manner in which the victims were bound, with precise, complicated knots, raised questions about the killers' backgrounds. Some investigators noted that the knots resembled those used in maritime applications, leading to speculation about a possible connection to someone with military or seafaring experience. The absence of Tina Sharp immediately elevated the case to include a kidnapping. An extensive search of the surrounding area was initiated, with law enforcement officers, Forest Service personnel, and volunteers combing the woods around the resort. Despite these efforts, there was no sign of the 12-year-old girl. Inside the cabin, investigators noted something else unusual. Despite the extreme violence of the attacks, 2 young children had slept through the entire ordeal. Rick and Greg Sharp's bedroom door had been closed, and they had remained undisturbed throughout the night. When questioned, neither boy reported hearing anything unusual. This suggested that the perpetrators had been careful to contain their actions to specific areas of the cabin, another indication of planning and control rather than a random attack. The timeline of events was difficult to establish precisely. The last known contact with anyone in the cabin had been around 10 p.m. on Saturday night. The coroner would later estimate that the murders occurred sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, based on factors such as body temperature and the progress of rigor mortis. As the first day of investigation came to a close, authorities had gathered physical evidence including blood samples, fingerprints, and the weapons believed to have been used in the attacks. They had begun interviewing residents of the Ketty Resort and establishing a list of potential witnesses. But they were no closer to understanding who had committed this crime or what had happened to Tina Sharp. The search for Tina continued into the night, with flashlights cutting through the darkness of the surrounding forest. Her disappearance added an urgent dimension to the already complex investigation. Was she a witness who had been taken to prevent her from identifying the killers? Or had she, too, fallen victim to the same perpetrators? These questions weighed heavily on investigators as they worked through that first critical night. In the days following the discovery of the murders, the investigation began to focus on several potential suspects. One of the first to draw attention was Martin Smart, who lived in nearby Cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn and his friend John Bo Bubaid. Smart had a history of violent behavior and was known to have a troubled relationship with his wife, who was friends with Sue Sharp. Martin Smart worked as a therapist's aide at the nearby Veterans Administration Hospital in Quincy. He had served in Vietnam and was reported to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. His friend Bo Bubaid, who was staying with the Smarts at the time, had a criminal record in Chicago and was rumored to have connections to organized crime, though this was never confirmed. During initial questioning, both Smart and Bubaid provided alibis for one another, claiming they had been at home in Cabin 26 throughout the night of the murders. Marilyn Smart later reported that she had been asleep and could not confirm their whereabouts during the critical hours. Another person of interest was a local man named Severin Hebert, who had been seen in the area that weekend and was known to have had some interactions with the Sharp family. However, Hebert also provided an alibi that initially appeared to check out. Investigators also considered the possibility that Sue Sharp's estranged husband, James, might have been involved. However, he was thousands of miles away in Connecticut at the time of the murders, with numerous witnesses able to confirm his whereabouts. As detectives dug deeper into the lives of the victims, they discovered that Sue Sharp had recently reported a missing hammer to the management of the Ketty Resort. Interestingly, Martin Smart had also reported a hammer missing from his tool collection around the same time. Given that one of the murder weapons appeared to be a hammer, these reports took on new significance. The investigation was complicated by the small-town dynamics of the area. Many residents knew one another, and information, both reliable and speculative, spread quickly through the community. Some potential witnesses were hesitant to come forward, either out of fear or because they didn't want to get involved in such a high-profile case. As the murder investigation progressed, the search for Tina Sharp continued with increasing urgency. Her description was circulated widely: a 12-year-old girl with long brown hair and brown eyes, approximately 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighing about 90 pounds. She had last been seen wearing a pink shirt and jeans. Law enforcement agencies across California and neighboring states were alerted to her disappearance. Her photograph appeared on missing persons flyers, in newspapers, and eventually on television programs dedicated to finding missing children. The case received national attention, with updates appearing in major newspapers and on network news broadcasts. Search teams methodically covered the area surrounding Keddie, focusing on the dense forests and rugged terrain that characterized the region. Divers examined the nearby Feather River and other bodies of water. The search expanded to include abandoned buildings, mines, and remote cabins throughout Plumas County. Despite these extensive efforts, weeks passed with no sign of Tina. Each passing day diminished the hope of finding her alive, but her family and the investigators refused to give up. The uncertainty of her fate added another layer of anguish to an already tragic situation. For Sheila Sharp and her surviving brothers, life had been completely upended. They were taken in by their father, James Sharp, who returned to California from Connecticut to care for his children. The trauma of what had happened in Cabin 28, combined with the ongoing uncertainty about Tina's whereabouts, created a burden almost too heavy to bear. As the investigation entered its second month, it faced mounting challenges. The physical evidence collected from the crime scene, while substantial, had not led to any definitive conclusions. Fingerprints found in the cabin either matched the victims or known visitors, or were too smudged or partial to be useful. Blood evidence, analyzed using the limited techniques available in 1981, provided some information about blood types but nothing that conclusively identified the perpetrators. The weapons believed to have been used in the attacks, a knife and hammer, had been left at the scene, but they yielded no fingerprints or other evidence that could link them to specific individuals. A second knife that investigators believed might have been used was never located. Interviews with residents of the Keddie Resort and the surrounding area produced numerous leads, but many of these led to dead ends. Some witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area on the night of the murders, while others recalled hearing unusual sounds. Without corroboration or physical evidence to support these accounts, investigators struggled to determine which, if any, were relevant to the case. The remote location of Keddie presented its own set of investigative challenges. The resort was accessible by only one main road, but numerous logging roads and hiking trails provided alternative routes in and out of the area. This made it difficult to establish a comprehensive picture of who had been in the vicinity on the night of the murders. Communication between different law enforcement agencies involved in the case was not always seamless. In an era before cell phones and email, coordination relied on landline telephones, radio communications, and in-person meetings. Information sometimes moved slowly between the various departments working on different aspects of the investigation. Public interest in the case remained high, putting pressure on investigators to provide answers. Media coverage, while helpful in keeping the case in the public eye, also generated rumors and speculation that could distract from the factual elements of the investigation. Despite these challenges, the Plumas County Sheriff's Department and the California Department of Justice continued their work, following every lead and examining every piece of evidence. But as spring turned to summer in 1981, the case of the Keddie murders remained unsolved, and Tina Sharp was still missing. On July 24, 1981, more than 3 months after the murders in Cabin 28, a breakthrough came in the case, though not the one anyone had hoped for. About 100 miles from Keddie, near Feather Falls in Butte County, a worker at a remote sawmill discovered human remains. Subsequent forensic examination confirmed what many had feared: the remains were those of Tina Sharp. The location where Tina was found was significant. It was an isolated area that would have been difficult to find without specific knowledge of the region. This suggested that whoever had taken her was familiar with the local geography. The condition of the remains made it difficult to determine the exact cause of death or whether she had been subjected to other forms of trauma before her death. For the Sharp family, the discovery brought a measure of closure to one aspect of their ordeal. They could now properly lay Tina to rest alongside her mother and brother. Yet it also deepened the mystery. Why had she been taken from the cabin? Why had she been transported so far from Keddy? And why had her body been left in such a remote location? The discovery of Tina's remains provided investigators with new evidence to examine and a new crime scene to process. But like much of the evidence in this case, it raised as many questions as it answered. As 1981 drew to a close, the investigation into the Keddy murders began to lose momentum. Despite the substantial resources that had been dedicated to the case, including assistance from the FBI and other federal agencies, no arrests had been made. The most promising suspects, Martin Smart and Beau Bubaid, had been questioned extensively but never charged. In a particularly frustrating development for investigators, both Smart and Bubaid left Keddy shortly after the murders. Bubaid returned to his native Chicago, where he died of natural causes in 1988. Smart moved to Oregon and later to other states, maintaining his innocence until his death in 2000. The case was further complicated by the passage of time. Witnesses' memories became less reliable, potential physical evidence degraded, and some individuals who might have had relevant information moved away from the area or died. The limitations of forensic technology in the early 1980s meant that some evidence that might be conclusive today could not be properly analyzed at the time. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, the case remained officially open but largely inactive. Periodic reviews would occur, often prompted by the anniversary of the crimes or when someone came forward with new information. But these reviews rarely led to significant progress. For the surviving Sharp children, life had to go on somehow. Sheila, Rick, and Greg grew up carrying the weight of what had happened in Cabin 28. Each found their own ways to cope with the trauma, but the lack of resolution regarding who had killed their family members made the healing process all the more difficult. The community of Keddy also struggled to recover from the shadow cast by the murders. The resort, already in decline before the crimes, saw its business dwindle further as potential visitors were deterred by the association with such a notorious case. In a symbolic end to an era, the Keddy Resort was sold in 2004, and Cabin 28, which had stood empty since the murders, was demolished in 2006. In 2013, more than 3 decades after the murders, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office assigned a new special investigator, Mike Gamberg, to take a fresh look at the case. Gamberg, who had been a patrol deputy in Plumas County at the time of the original crimes, had a personal interest in seeing the case resolved. With advances in forensic technology and investigative techniques, evidence that had been collected in 1981 could now be analyzed in ways that weren't possible at the time. DNA testing, which had not existed when the crimes occurred, offered new possibilities for identifying the perpetrators if biological evidence had been preserved. Gamberg's review of the case uncovered some troubling inconsistencies in how the original investigation had been conducted. Some evidence appeared to have been overlooked or improperly processed. Certain leads that seemed promising had not been fully explored. And some witnesses whose accounts might have been valuable had never been formally interviewed. One particularly significant development came when Gamberg discovered a recording of an anonymous call made to the Plumas County Sheriff's Office several years after the murders. The caller claimed to have information about where Tina Sharp's remains had been disposed of, providing details that matched the location where she was ultimately found. The recording had somehow been misplaced or overlooked during the original investigation. Gamberg also located and interviewed new witnesses who had been reluctant to come forward in 1981. Some of these individuals provided information that supported the theory that Martin Smart and Beau Bubaid had been involved in the crimes. Others offered context about the social dynamics and relationships within the Keddy community at the time of the murders. Perhaps most importantly, Gamberg's investigation uncovered a letter that Martin Smart had allegedly written to his wife Marilyn after leaving Keddy. In this letter, Smart purportedly confessed to killing Sue Sharp but denied harming the children. While the authenticity of this letter would be debated, it represented a potentially significant piece of evidence that had not been part of the original case file. These developments brought new hope that the Ketty murders might finally be solved. The case had never been forgotten, not by the surviving Sharp family members, not by the original investigators, and not by the community that had been so deeply affected by the crimes. Now, there was reason to believe that justice, long delayed, might finally be possible. In 2016, 35 years after the murders, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office announced that they had made significant progress in the investigation. Based on the new evidence discovered by investigator Gamberg, they now considered Martin Smart and Beau Bubaid their primary suspects. Though both men were deceased by this time, the evidence pointing to their involvement was stronger than ever. DNA testing of a hammer found near the crime scene in 1981 revealed a possible link to the murders. This hammer was believed to be the one that Martin Smart had reported missing around the time of the crimes. Additional physical evidence, re-examined using modern techniques, also supported the theory of Smart and Bubaid's involvement. The sheriff's office also revealed that they had uncovered evidence suggesting a possible motive. Martin Smart had been angry with Sue Sharp for encouraging his wife Marilyn to leave him. In the context of Smart's history of violence and controlling behavior, this motive seemed plausible to investigators. For the surviving Sharp family members, these developments brought a measure of closure. While no one would ever stand trial for the murders of their loved ones, knowing that law enforcement had identified the likely perpetrators provided some answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. In 2018, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office officially declared that they considered the case solved, naming Martin Smart and Beau Bubaid as the perpetrators of the Ketty Cabin murders. While some questions remain, particularly regarding the exact sequence of events on that April night in 1981, the core mystery of who was responsible had finally been resolved. The Ketty murders left an indelible mark on all who were connected to the case. For the surviving Sharp children, the trauma of that night shaped their lives in countless ways. Sheila Sharp, who discovered the bodies, has spoken publicly about her experiences and the long journey toward healing. Rick and Greg, the youngest brothers who were spared during the attack, grew up in the shadow of this family tragedy. The case has become part of the cultural memory of the region, a dark chapter in the history of Plumas County. It has been the subject of books, documentaries, and countless discussions in true crime forums. A 2008 documentary, Cabin 28, The Ketty Murders, brought renewed attention to the case and helped keep it in the public consciousness during a period when official investigation had stalled. In a physical sense, little remains of the original crime scene. The Ketty Resort is long gone, with the land redeveloped for other purposes. Cabin 28 was demolished, removing the physical reminder of what occurred there. Yet the memory of Sue, Johnny, Tina, and Dana lives on in the hearts of those who knew them and in the continued interest in ensuring that the truth about what happened to them is known. The Ketty case also serves as a reminder of how investigative techniques and forensic science have evolved over time. Cases that seemed unsolvable in the 1980s can now be approached with tools and methods that weren't available to earlier generations of investigators. For the community of Plumas County, the resolution of the case represented the closing of a wound that had remained open for too long. While nothing can undo the tragedy that occurred in Cabin 28, knowing the truth about what happened there allows for a different kind of healing, one based on acknowledgement rather than uncertainty. As we conclude this story, we remember Sue, Johnny, Dana, and Tina not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as individuals whose lives mattered and whose memory continues to touch those who learn about their story. May they rest in peace, and may those who love them find comfort in knowing that they are not forgotten. If you're still awake and listening, I hope this exploration of this case has been informative while also providing a soothing background for sleep. Please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 5. Ray Rivera was born on June 10, 1973, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, before his family relocated to the United States. Those who knew Ray described him as intelligent, creative, and exceptionally kind. Standing at an impressive 6 feet 5 inches, he had a physical presence that matched his outsized personality and ambitions. After studying at the University of Florida, Ray pursued his creative passions, working as a writer, filmmaker, and financial journalist. His interests were varied and deep, from finance to filmmaking, from literature to screenwriting. Friends recall his enthusiasm when discussing projects and ideas, his eyes lighting up as he spoke about his latest creative endeavor. Ray was the kind of person who made you feel important, one friend later told reporters. When he talked to you, you had his complete attention. He remembered details about your life and always followed up on things you'd mentioned in previous conversations. In 2004, Ray married Allison, whom friends described as his perfect match. Their wedding in Puerto Rico was a joyful celebration, with photographs showing a beaming couple surrounded by loved ones. They settled in Baltimore, Maryland, buying a house in the Federal Hill neighborhood and beginning what they hoped would be a long life together. Those who visited their home noted how it reflected their personalities, books everywhere, creative projects in various stages of completion, and a warmth that made guests feel instantly welcome. They had recently adopted a dog named Baxter who quickly became an important part of their family. They seemed like they had it all figured out, one neighbor would later comment. Young, in love, building careers they were passionate about. They were the couple everyone wanted to be. Central to Ray's story is his longtime friendship with Porter Stansberry. The two had been close friends since high school, maintaining their connection through college and into their professional lives. Their bond was strong enough that when Porter established his financial publishing company, Stansberry Research, in Baltimore, he eventually convinced Ray to relocate there. In late 2004, Ray accepted Porter's offer to work for his company as a writer and videographer. Ray and Allison moved from Southern California to Baltimore, buying their historic house in Federal Hill just a short drive from the Stansberry Research offices. Ray's role at the company involved producing video content about financial topics and writing for their publications. While not primarily a financial expert himself, Ray was a skilled communicator who could translate complex investment concepts into compelling content for their audience. The move to Baltimore represented not just a career opportunity but a chance to work alongside his best friend. Porter was already established in the financial publishing world, and his company was growing rapidly. For Ray, this appeared to be a perfect next step, combining his creative skills with stable employment provided by someone he trusted implicitly. Friends observed that Ray seemed to flourish in Baltimore initially. He enjoyed the historic character of the city, was excited about renovating their new home, and spoke enthusiastically about the work he was doing. He and Allison were planning for their future, discussing starting a family, and integrating themselves into their new community. Porter and Ray's relationship appeared, by all accounts, to be as strong as ever. They spent time together both professionally and socially, with Porter even designating Ray as the family's emergency contact, a sign of the deep trust between them. In the months leading up to May 2006, subtle changes began to appear in Ray's behavior, according to those closest to him. While still the warm, engaging person everyone knew, Allison later recalled that he seemed increasingly anxious about certain aspects of his life. Ray had transitioned away from full-time work at Stansberry Research and was pursuing freelance opportunities while working on a screenplay. This creative project was important to him, a mystery screenplay that he worked on diligently. Writing had always been one of his passions, and the opportunity to focus on this creative endeavor seemed to energize him. However, Allison also noted some unusual behaviors. Ray had begun to express concerns about their home security, checking the locks multiple times and seeming unusually vigilant. When asked about these concerns, he would downplay them, saying he was just being cautious. Given that they lived in an urban area, these precautions didn't initially seem excessive to those around him. During this period, Ray and Allison were also preparing for her parents' upcoming visit and planning a trip to New Mexico where they would celebrate their upcoming wedding anniversary. They had dinner reservations, plans for sightseeing, and were looking forward to this special time together. These future plans would later stand in stark contrast to theories that Ray might have been contemplating ending his life. In April and early May of 2006, Ray continued his freelance work and screenplay writing. He maintained his regular routines, walking their dog, meeting with friends, discussing future projects. On Mother's Day 2006, just days before his disappearance, Ray called his mother and had a normal, cheerful conversation, making plans to see her soon. There was absolutely nothing in that call that raised any red flags, his mother would later tell investigators. He was talking about the future, about projects he was excited about Allison and their plans together. On Monday, May 15, 2006, Ray spent the day working from home while Allison was out of town on business. According to phone records, he made several routine calls and worked on his computer throughout the day. Friends who spoke with him described these conversations as perfectly normal. There were no goodbye messages, no unusual statements, nothing to suggest what would unfold over the next 24 hours. As the evening of May 15 turned into the morning of May 16, there was no indication that this ordinary Monday would be Ray Rivera's last day at home, or that it would mark the beginning of one of Baltimore's most perplexing mysteries. As you continue to relax to the sound of gentle rainfall, let's explore what happened on that fateful day in May when Ray Rivera disappeared. Tuesday, May 16, 2006, began as an ordinary day in the Rivera household. Allison was away on a business trip to Richmond, Virginia, having left the previous day. Ray was home in their Federal Hill residence, continuing his freelance work and screenplay writing. Their dog Baxter kept him company as he moved through his normal routine. Phone records would later show that Ray made several routine calls in the morning hours, checking in with contacts about freelance projects, touching base with friends. Nothing in these conversations indicated distress or unusual behavior. He even made plans to meet with someone the following day to discuss a potential work opportunity. The weather in Baltimore that day was mild and partly cloudy, an unremarkable spring day in Maryland. Neighbors who saw Ray walking Baxter that morning described his demeanor as normal. He waved hello, exchanged pleasantries about the weather, and continued on his way. These ordinary interactions would later take on poignant significance as the last normal moments of Ray's life. Around midday, Ray spoke with Allison by phone. Their conversation was routine, discussing her business trip, making plans for when she returned, and talking about her parents' upcoming visit. She later recalled nothing unusual in his voice or their discussion. They ended the call as they always did, with expressions of love and plans to talk again later. This ordinary Tuesday was about to take an extraordinary turn. At approximately 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday evening, Ray received a phone call on the family's home line. Allison would later learn about this call from their home alarm system, which recorded when the call came in but not the content of the conversation or who it was from. What is known is that immediately after this call, Ray's behavior changed dramatically. He told Baxter he would be right back, rushed out of the house, and drove away in his car. He left behind his personal effects, not even taking his wallet. The precipitous nature of his departure suggested extreme urgency. When Allison called home later that evening and received no answer, she wasn't immediately concerned. She assumed Ray might be walking Baxter or had stepped out briefly. When she still couldn't reach him the following morning, her concern grew. She called neighbors who agreed to check on the house. What they found was disturbing. the house was empty except for Baxter, who had been left without food or water, something completely out of character for the devoted pet owner. Ray's car was gone, but his wallet remained behind. Most concerning, he hadn't called Allison to explain his absence, something he would never normally fail to do. Alarmed, Allison cut her business trip short and rushed back to Baltimore. Upon arriving home on Wednesday, she immediately contacted the police to report Ray missing. She also reached out to their circle of friends, including Porter Stansberry, to organize a search. The response was immediate and substantial. Porter reportedly offered company resources to help find Ray, including hiring a private investigator and offering a $1,000 reward for information. Flyers with Ray's photograph appeared throughout Baltimore. Friends and colleagues formed search parties, combing areas where Ray might have gone. Days passed with no sign of Ray. His car, a 2001 Mitsubishi Montero, was found parked in a lot near the Belvedere Hotel, an elegant Beaux-Arts building from 1903 that had been converted to condominiums and offices, while still maintaining an events venue called the 13th floor. The car contained no clues about Ray's whereabouts or why he might have gone to this location, which was about a 5-minute drive from his home. The discovery of the car shifted the search to the area surrounding the Belvedere, but initially yielded no results. As one day turned into several, hope began to diminish, and the mystery only deepened. On Thursday, May 25, 2006, 8 days after Ray's disappearance, an employee of the Belvedere was walking through a little-used conference room called the Hell's Annex, which sat adjacent to the main building. Looking up at the lower roof of the adjacent structure, he noticed something disturbing, a hole in the metal roof, as if something had crashed through it. Police were called to investigate, and what they discovered sent shockwaves through the search effort and the city of Baltimore. Ray Rivera's body was found in an unoccupied office space beneath the hole in the roof. He was wearing flip-flops, shorts, and a shirt, casual attire consistent with someone who had left home expecting to return quickly. The medical examiner determined that Ray had suffered injuries consistent with a fall from a great height. The location of his body in relation to the hole in the roof suggested he had fallen or jumped from the top of the Belvedere, crashing through the metal roof of the annex in the process. This discovery transformed a missing persons case into something far more perplexing. How and why had Ray Rivera ended up on the roof of the historic Belvedere Hotel? Why would he have gone there in such a hurry? And most importantly, what had happened on that roof to result in his fatal fall? The Baltimore Police Department formally classified the death as unexplained, a designation that acknowledged the unusual circumstances while leaving open multiple possibilities: suicide, accident, or something else entirely. For Allison Rivera and those who knew Ray best, the notion of suicide seemed inconceivable. He had no history of mental illness, was making plans for the future, and had given no indication of suicidal thoughts to anyone. The circumstances of his disappearance, rushing out after a phone call, seemed more consistent with responding to an emergency than planning to end his life. As investigators began to piece together Ray's final movements and the circumstances surrounding his death, the case would only grow more bizarre, with the discovery of a cryptic note that would become one of the most discussed elements of the entire mystery. In the days following the discovery of Ray's body, Allison was sorting through his belongings when she made a startling find. Behind their computer, tucked away as if hidden, was a folded note taped to the desk. The content of this note would become one of the most discussed and analyzed aspects of the entire case. The note began with a statement asking that it not be opened except by those I love and trust. What followed was a typed document containing what can only be described as a stream of consciousness writing, references to Freemasonry, films directed by Stanley Kubrick, a list of people Ray knew and admired, and various phrases that appeared to be drawn from a Masonic oath. The note was formatted strangely, with some portions typed in tiny font sizes. It included seemingly random phrases like, "Whom virtue unites, death will not separate," and references to "the game." Many sections read like a gratitude list, naming friends, family members, and personal heroes who had positively impacted Ray's life. Perhaps most puzzling was that the note was signed, "Who I am is the following, I am Ray O. Rivera," as if he were introducing himself to an unknown reader. It was dated and appeared to have been created just days before his disappearance. When investigators analyzed the note, opinions were divided. Some viewed it as evidence of a declining mental state, potentially supporting the theory of suicide. Others saw it as a creative exercise related to Ray's screenwriting, noting that many of the films referenced shared themes of secret societies or hidden realities. It read more like a creative person working through ideas than someone planning to harm themselves, noted one friend who had worked with Ray on writing projects. His mind just worked differently, making connections between things that weren't obvious to everyone else. Allison insisted that while the note was unusual, nothing about it suggested suicidal intentions. In fact, she pointed out that much of it expressed gratitude for life and the people in it. She believed it might have been related to a writing project or perhaps inspired by Ray's interest in filmmaker Stanley Kubrick, whose work was prominently referenced. The note has been analyzed by amateur sleuths and professional investigators alike, with some suggesting it might be a code or contain hidden messages. Others have proposed it could have been written under duress or while experiencing a brief psychotic episode. To this day, the true meaning and purpose of the note remains unknown. As investigators reconstructed the likely scenario of Ray's death, they faced a perplexing physical problem. If Ray had indeed fallen from the roof of the Belvedere, the trajectory required to reach the point where he crashed through the annex roof seemed nearly impossible. The hole in the metal roof was located approximately 45 feet horizontally from the edge of the main Belvedere roof. For Ray to have landed at this spot, he would have needed to take a running start and make an extraordinary leap, a distance that many experts deemed physically improbable, if not impossible, for even a trained athlete. Frank Gaffney, a former police officer who worked security at the Belvedere, told reporters, "I don't believe that he could have fallen from the main roof and hit that spot. The distance is too great. You'd have to take a running jump, and even then, I'm not sure it's physically possible to clear that distance." This physical impossibility led some investigators to consider alternative scenarios. Perhaps Ray had fallen or jumped from a lower point, such as a ledge or balcony on the side of the building. However, an exhaustive review of the building's architecture failed to identify any such point that aligned with the location of the hole. Others suggested that perhaps Ray had been dropped from a helicopter or thrown from the roof by others. However, no witnesses reported seeing a helicopter in the area that night, and the medical examiner found no evidence of a struggle or injuries inconsistent with a fall. The police investigated whether Ray could have accessed the roof legally. The door to the roof was normally locked, with access restricted to maintenance personnel. No security cameras covered the roof access points, leaving a critical gap in understanding how Ray might have reached the roof in the first place. Adding to the mystery was the condition of Ray's phone and glasses, which were found on the roof of the Belvedere and appeared undamaged, strange considering the devastating impact that had damaged the roof and caused fatal injuries. His money clip, however, was never recovered despite extensive searches. These physical inconsistencies created a profound puzzle. The evidence clearly showed that Ray had somehow fallen through the roof of the annex, but the physics of how he reached that point remained inexplicable. This fundamental contradiction would fuel speculation and alternative theories for years to come. The Baltimore Police Department faced the challenging task of making sense of Ray Rivera's death despite its many contradictions. After several months of investigation, the medical examiner officially ruled the manner of death as undetermined rather than accident, suicide, or homicide. This unusual classification acknowledged that there wasn't enough evidence to conclusively support any single theory. Detective Michael Bayer, who led the investigation, later expressed frustration at being unable to provide clear answers to Allison and the Rivera family. In most cases, the evidence points clearly in one direction, Bayer would later say in an interview. With Ray Rivera, every answer we found just led to more questions. The police investigation focused on several key elements: the phone call that prompted Ray's hasty departure from home, his movements between leaving his house and arriving at the Belvedere, and how he accessed the roof. Despite interviewing numerous potential witnesses and reviewing available security footage, they were unable to establish a complete timeline of Ray's final hours. One particularly frustrating dead end involved the phone call that appeared to have triggered Ray's departure. Police traced the call to the switchboard at Stansberry Research but couldn't determine which specific extension had placed the call or who had made it. Multiple employees were interviewed, but no one admitted to making the call or knowing its content. The official investigation also examined Ray's mental state, interviewing friends, family members, and colleagues. While they found evidence of some increased anxiety in the weeks before his death, particularly related to home security, there was no history of mental illness, no previous suicide attempts, and no farewell messages or other typical indicators of suicidal intentions. By late 2006, the active investigation had largely stalled due to lack of new evidence. The case remained open but inactive, a status that would remain unchanged for years. One of the most unusual aspects of the case emerged after Ray's death, when journalists and investigators attempted to speak with employees at Stansberry Research. According to multiple sources, including reporters who covered the story, the company instructed employees not to speak about Ray or his death. This directive was particularly striking given that Porter Stansberry and Ray had been close friends since high school. Porter had initially helped organize search efforts and offered a reward for information, but following the discovery of Ray's body, he reportedly did not speak publicly about the case and declined interview requests from both media and investigators. The Baltimore Sun reported that when they attempted to interview Stansberry employees, they were referred to a company spokesman who stated that a directive had been issued not to comment on the matter. This apparent reluctance to cooperate fully with the investigation raised questions among both investigators and Ray's family. Some journalists speculated that the company's silence might have been related to legal concerns. In the year prior to Ray's death, Stansberry Research, then called Agora Financial, had been charged by the Securities and Exchange Commission with defrauding subscribers through false stock information. The company had been fined $1.5 million in the case. Ray had not been implicated in these legal issues, and it remained unclear whether there was any connection between the SEC case and his death. However, the company's apparent unwillingness to assist fully in the investigation created an additional layer of mystery and speculation. Alison Rivera would later express disappointment that Porter, once so close to Ray, seemed to distance himself after the tragedy. This shift in behavior from such a longtime friend added to the painful confusion surrounding Ray's death. As the official investigation stalled, alternative theories emerged from various sources: private investigators hired by the family, journalists covering the case, and eventually internet sleuths who became fascinated by the mysterious circumstances. One theory proposed that Ray might have witnessed something he wasn't meant to see or learned information that put him in danger. His background in financial journalism, combined with his work for a company that had faced SEC charges, led some to speculate that he might have discovered financial improprieties that made him a target. Supporters of this theory pointed to Ray's apparent concern about home security in the weeks before his death and the mysterious phone call that prompted his final journey. They suggested that perhaps he had been lured to the Belvedere and met with foul play, with his body being staged to suggest a suicide. Another theory focused on the Freemason references in Ray's note. While Ray was not known to be a Freemason himself, some of the language in his note appeared to reference Masonic oaths and rituals. This led to speculation about whether he might have been involved with the organization or investigating it for a writing project. The Freemason theory gained traction among some internet commentators who noted that the Belvedere itself had historical connections to Freemasonry, having been built by a prominent mason in the early 1900s. However, no concrete evidence emerged to suggest Ray had any actual involvement with the organization beyond his apparent interest in it. A third theory suggested that Ray might have experienced a brief psychotic episode, a sudden break from reality that led him to the roof of the Belvedere. Mental health experts noted that such episodes can sometimes occur without prior history, particularly in men in their 30s. The unusual note, combined with reported anxiety about home security, was cited as potential evidence for this theory. However, those closest to Ray consistently rejected this explanation, emphasizing his clear-headed nature and lack of any signs of serious mental distress. His final phone conversations on the day of his disappearance had been completely normal, and he had been actively making plans for the coming days and weeks. In the years following Ray's death, Alison Rivera refused to accept that she might never know what truly happened to her husband. She continued to advocate for further investigation, working with private investigators and eventually bringing the case to wider attention through media coverage. "I knew Ray better than anyone," she told a Baltimore reporter on the 5th anniversary of his death. "The idea that he would commit suicide makes absolutely no sense. Something happened that night, and I won't stop until I know what it was." Alison carefully preserved Ray's note and other personal effects, believing they might eventually provide clues if reviewed by the right experts. She compiled a detailed timeline of his last known movements and kept records of all witness statements and investigative findings. Her persistence led to periodic reviews of the case by law enforcement, though these reviews largely reaffirmed the original, undetermined, classification rather than providing new insights. Nevertheless, she continued to pursue every possible avenue for information. Perhaps most difficult for Alison was navigating her relationship with Porter Stansberry and others who had been close to both her and Ray. The apparent reluctance of some former friends to discuss the case created painful divisions at a time when she most needed support. "The hardest part isn't just losing Ray," she confided to a close friend. "It's feeling like some people who supposedly cared about him don't seem interested in finding out what really happened." Despite these challenges, Alison rebuilt her life while keeping Ray's memory and the search for truth alive. She eventually relocated from Baltimore but maintained connections with those still working to solve the case. Ray's case received renewed attention in July 2020 when it was featured in the first episode of Netflix's reboot of Unsolved Mysteries. The episode, titled "Mystery on the Rooftop," introduced the puzzling circumstances of Ray's death to a global audience and generated significant public interest. Following the Netflix coverage, online forums and social media groups dedicated to the case proliferated. Amateur sleuths analyzed every detail, from the contents of Ray's note to the architecture of the Belvedere, offering theories ranging from the plausible to the highly speculative. This renewed attention brought both benefits and challenges. On one hand, it generated new tips and perspectives that investigators could consider. The Baltimore Police Department reported receiving numerous calls after the episode aired, though they did not publicly disclose whether any provided substantial new leads. On the other hand, the proliferation of theories online sometimes veered into territory that was painful for Ray's family and friends. Speculation about his mental state, his marriage, or his character often seemed to lose sight of the real person at the center of the case. Journalists who had covered the story from the beginning noted how the case exemplified both the best and worst aspects of public involvement in unsolved mysteries. The collective effort to find answers demonstrated how deeply people could care about a stranger's fate, while the more sensationalistic elements showed how easily facts could be distorted in the pursuit of an engaging narrative. Through it all, those who had known Ray personally continued to emphasize that the public discussion often missed the most important aspect of the case, the remarkable person who had been lost. They described his kindness, his creativity, his sense of humor, and the many ways he had touched their lives. Now, nearly 20 years after Ray Rivera's death, many fundamental questions remain unanswered. who called Ray from the Stansbury offices on the evening of May 16, 2006, and what was said in that conversation that prompted him to leave his house so urgently. How did Ray access the roof of the Belvedere, and was he alone when he did so? Given the physical improbability of the jump, how did his body end up where it was found? What was the true purpose and meaning of the cryptic note found taped behind his computer? Why did some of those closest to Ray appear reluctant to cooperate fully with the investigation into his death? These questions continue to haunt both investigators and those who care about finding the truth. The passage of time has made answers increasingly difficult to find, as memories fade, witnesses move away or pass on, and physical evidence deteriorates. Yet the case remains officially open, and the possibility remains that new information could emerge. Advances in forensic technology, a witness finally deciding to come forward, or the discovery of previously overlooked evidence could still provide the breakthrough that has eluded investigators for so long. While the circumstances of Ray Rivera's death have become the subject of endless speculation and discussion, those who knew him best have worked to ensure that his life is not defined solely by its mysterious end. They speak of a man whose warmth, intelligence, and creativity touched many lives during his 32 years. Friends recall his infectious enthusiasm for creative projects, his ability to connect deeply with others, and his loyalty as a friend and partner. Former colleagues describe his professionalism and innovative thinking. Family members cherish memories of holiday gatherings, inside jokes, and the unconditional love he offered. Ray had this ability to make you feel like you were the most important person in the room, one childhood friend shared at a memorial service. He wasn't just listening to respond, he was listening to understand. That's incredibly rare. His passion for writing and filmmaking produced a body of work that survives him, articles, scripts, and video productions that showcase his talents and perspective. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you not just the mystery of this case but the reminder that even in the darkest stories, there are elements of human resilience and the enduring search for truth. Our background sounds will carry you into tranquility as you drift towards sleep. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.